So moving forward, you guys should have your outer frame of your headache rack cut out and tack welded together. So I got mine here, and I'm up here at the front of the bed. This is the front side of the bed. So the first thing that we're going to need to do this next step, which is going to be solid welding all of our joints together on our headache rack, is we're going to need to cut out two pieces like this. This is 1 3/4 inch tube, or a square tube. You're going to need two pieces of this that is 24 inches long. You should have approximately 4 feet left of this size of tube, which is 1 3/4 square tube. So pause the video, go cut out two of these 24 inches long 1 3/4 inch tube, and then come back and we will go over the next step. So once you have that done, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to actually lift this frame up and lay it on top of the bed, and we're going to turn the bed into our work table. So just position your headache rack frame like I'm going to have mine on the bed, and then just follow along. So kind of get the bottom edges of your headache rack semi-flush with the front of your bed. Doesn't have to be exact, but just kind of where, within 1/2 inch or so of these two surfaces being flush. And then we're going to use these as levelers because, as we know, there's an 1 3/4 difference between the top surface of our outer frame and the top surface of our inner frame. This is 1 3/4 tube. We're going to set the top side of our headache rack on our 1 3/4 tube, and it's going to level it to the same level as the surface of our outer frame. And then once we do that, get everything else set, we're going to solid weld it so that our headache rack is nice and level and square with where it's actually going to be installed. So get your two 24 inch 1 3/4 square tube pieces and put them under here. So doing that should make your rack level on top of the bed. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to tack weld these outside corners so that these are at the correct outer width. So if you got a single rear wheel bed, your bed should be 84 inches wide overall, and your headache rack outside corner should be 83 inches. So 84 inch wide bed, 83 inch wide outer corners of your rack frame. That means we're going to have to come in 1/2 inch from each side. So I've drawn a line 1/2 inch from the edge off each side. And then the next thing we're going to do is we're actually going to tack weld these into place, and basically what we're going for is this outside corner here needs to line up with our line 1/2 inch from the edge, and also this bottom side needs to be flush with the front side of the bed. So I use a magnet. If you can also use a square to do this, but it just makes it so it contacts and ensures that these are both in the same plane. Once we have this side in the same plane and lined up with the line, I'm going to go ahead and tack weld that. And make sure it's a nice heavy tack, but one you can also cut off easily once we're done. And we're going to do the same thing on the other side. And this should only be tack welded so that your rack has some flexion in it still. And the reason we didn't solid weld it is because we wanted to flex this to be the correct width. I'm going to do the same thing over here. Flush it up with the front, line it up with the outside line, and tack weld. Okay, so once you have that done, we have one final thing we need to do before we solid weld all our joints, and that is measure to make sure that the top C-piece is not at any angle that isn't square with the bed. So the way we do that is we're going to measure from the bottom side of piece C of your headache rack frame to the outside front edge of your bed, and measure down your frame member to make sure your measurement's square. But what we're going for is we want the measurement between this side and this side to be the same. And so this measurement is shorter than the one over there. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to tap it a little bit and then remeasure. And since you got some flexion in it, you should be able to tap it back and forth until both of these measurements are equal. Once that happens, once you get it tapped back and forth so both of these measurements are equal, we're going to clamp this down right here to your inner frame before we weld up solid. That way everything's square and nice, and it's exactly where we want it to be before we solid weld it. So mine is square. I'm going to go ahead and clamp it. And if you don't have clamps, if you're running low on clamps, you can tack weld your headache rack frame to your spacer tube and then your spacer tube to your inner frame. Just make sure you weld it in a way that's easy to cut off, but it does need to be anchored in 4 positions. I got it tack welded here, clamped here. I'm going to clamp it here as well and tack welded here. So get your rack positioned at the proper width. Make sure these 2 measurements are the same, and then we'll be able to move on to actually solid welding our joints. I got my headache rack frame welded on. It's tack welded down at those 2 outside corners and clamped here. You guys need to have the same thing done. You don't have to have it clamped. It can be tack welded, but it needs to be solid in 4 positions before we solid weld it, because it's going to get hot and we don't want it to warp or tweak in any way out of square. So the next thing we're going to do is, at this point you should only have tack welds on all the inside corners. So now we're going to tack weld all the outside corners on all of our joints, and once we've done that, we can go ahead and solid weld these. So get yourself a clamp. It can be a C-clamp or a vice grip, but definitely clamp all these joints on the seam to tack weld the outer corners, just because we want to have a perfect surface to grind off. We don't want it to be unlevel in any way. So just clamp on every joint to tack weld the outer corners, and then after that you can solid weld all of these joints on the top, inside, and outside. We're going to let this cool completely before we cut it loose and unclamp it to flip it over to weld the backside joints, because we need to add the piece D cross member before we do that, and if we cut it loose before it cools, it's going to shrink this thing, and we don't want that to happen. So tack weld, solid weld, both sides, top, inside, outside, and then we will put in the crossbar. So I got my outer frame of the cab rack is solid welded, and it is still clamped down and tack welded. You don't want to cut it loose yet, because if you do, it might warp and shrink these legs. So before we cut it loose and flip it over to weld the other side, we're going to add our cross member, which is our piece D from the cab rack diagram. So you should have a piece that looks something like this. It should have 15-degree angles cut at both ends opposite of each other. So what I've done here is I've used our shelf jigs that we've used multiple times on this project so far. We use these to hang our sides and whatever. I welded it so that this is going to be used to set this so that the top of our piece D is at the same plane as this. So I'll just go ahead and show you that. It's going to be easier than explaining it. But basically, These shelf jigs just allow me to hang it on here and puts this at the same level as this. So the long side of your piece is going to be down. So weld a couple shelf jigs on here so you can hang this at the right level. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to square it up. So I'm just going to measure from the front of the bed because it is our reference point that is at the flush plane of the bottom of this. So it's a adequate reference point to measure the squareness of our cross member. So just measure in 2 different positions until you have the same measurement. So it's probably going to be in the neighborhood of 15.5 or so inches from the front side of your bed to the bottom side of your cross member. And so it could be plus or minus a 1/16, but just make sure both these measurements are the same, and that way you know this piece here is square on the bed. So once you have that squared up, you can go ahead and tack weld your corners, and then you can cut off your shelf jigs, solid weld this top seam on both sides. Do not solid weld this seam, because if you do, when we cut this loose, your legs are going to pull inwards from the heat that you weld right here. So don't weld these. We will weld these once we weld the cab rack to the bed coming up. So anyways, tack all your corners, cut off your shelf jigs both sides, weld solid the top seam, the back side seam, and then we will be ready to cut this loose and flip it over. So as you can see here, I got my rack cut loose from the bed. Do not cut your rack loose from the bed and unclamp it until your welds have had time to cool. Mine have cooled off completely, that way that the outside corners of my legs don't shrink in if I prematurely cut it off and it's still hot and has time to shrink. So make sure your welds look cool before you cut it off. The next thing we're going to do is, in no particular order, we need to grind off all our welds of our joint junctions up here, as well as our seam right here. I have a few welds that I welded into my slitter disc scars, but we're going to grind all that off anyway. So I'm looking at the show side of my rack. This is the side that's going to be facing towards the back of your flatbed and the side that everyone's going to see when they're behind you. So the way you can tell is that this plane of your crossbar is going to be flush with the plane of your outer frame. The back side, there's going to be like a 3/4 inch discrepancy between the face of this and the back side. So in no particular order, all these welds need grinded off on all of your sides. The back sides are going to need welded. Flip this around. So as you can see here, I still got these seams to weld up. This backside joint needs welded here. So you can weld these up first and then grind all of them off. You can grind your front sides off and then weld the back sides and then grind it off. Doesn't really matter, but all of that needs done. So we're going to fast move the video of grinding, and then I'm going to weld these seams up and grind those off as well. And at the end of this, you should have the outer frame of your headache rack complete.